We're live. Good afternoon, everybody. All 119 of you who've tuned in for this webinar launch of this absolutely fabulous book. Rogues Gallery, Matthew Blackman and Nick Dall. Matthew, stick up your hand and everybody can see you. There we go. Nick, stick up your hand. There you go. Everybody knows who you are. I'm Marianne. I'm the associate editor of the Daily Maverick. I was just saying to both these authors that I have got to the Smith murders, and I don't want them to do any spoilers for me. This is one of the most engaging and wonderful historical accounts that I've read in a long, long time. Of course, the book is available at the Daily Maverick bookshop and anywhere else where you will see it on the stand. Let's just begin by saying that, of course, past histories, we were just chatting about this in the green room before we went live. They would have described the arrival of Europeans here in the Western Cape, and the Dutch East India Company as the beginning of the Great Sea. In actual fact, corruption, not civilization. What this book does is wonderful because it takes us back to the very moment those boats arrive on this shore, and literally from the minute people set foot on the shore, it begins. What I love about the book is that it says on here that it is an irreverent history of corruption in South Africa, and that is specifically put there for the people over in the Twitter asylum who have begun to assume that this is a book which is an apology for current corruption. What we were discussing beforehand is if you want to know your present, go back to your past, and so then you can maybe understand your future. Okay, guys, I think let's jump in. This book is full of mkhandlas, it's full of Vrede dairy farms, it's full of ANN 7s, it's full of the new age. Back then, I've realized that South Africans, usually you have a serial killer or a serial perpetrator. We are serial victims of a succession of utterly corrupt bastards, every single one of them. All right, so I think let's start off. I don't know whether Matthew or Nick, you want to take this one. The idea for the book and why, and how did you go about selecting from a vast cast of thousands these particular rogues for this particular book? Who wants to take that one? Matthew.
Well, how we started was, we've been friends for a long time, and we lived in Argentina together. And we started discussing doing something together a couple of years ago, and we couldn't quite work it out. We started trying to sell rum for some reason. I'm not really sure why. And then we sort of sat down and said to one another, we should write, considering we're both kind of writers, why don't we write a book together? And then we spent a considerable amount of sort of months trying to think of what we could write about together. And then all of a sudden, we'd both I'd written about corruption and Rhodes, and Nick had written about corruption and Willem Adrian van der Stel, and we suddenly looked at one another, we're like, this is the obvious, why aren't we writing a book about the history of corruption? This must be, and why has nobody done this before? It kind of struck us as quite odd that, we'd kind of stumbled onto this idea. So yeah, that's kind of how it began. The process of, Nick, do you want to talk about how we put it all together?
Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, we each did half of the chapters. But in terms of finding the people, so some of them had to be there from the start. We knew about Willem Adrian van der Stel, we knew about Rhodes. We knew that there'd have to be a fair whack about apartheid. And we obviously knew Zuma would be there at the end, and not just Zuma, his cronies. Some of the other people took a bit more finding, like, so the second chapter of the book is about a chap called Sir George Young. He's one of my favorite rogues.
Yes, you said he's one of your favorite rogues, and I just want to say he's called the what twaddler? He's
the lofty twaddler.
The lofty twaddler.
Yeah. So like for him, I literally found him I found one of these great old South African history books. Some of you guys have probably heard of a guy called George McCall Thiel. He was a Canadian who wrote some of the first histories of South Africa, and I found an online version, and I just searched for the word corruption. And in this one chapter, it just came up everywhere. So I was like, geez, I better read this one. And that's how I found him. So there were different ways to finding our rogues.
Yeah, well, I mean, just tell us a bit about George Young. I mean, he was an ignorant imbecile, somebody called him. Lost his
Yeah.
He privatized the company gardens.
Yeah.
He had a salary of 9 million a year. He levied charges on billiard tables. This is how
And brandy.
And brandy. And then
Riding that to a Cape Farmer.
Absolutely. And he was found, there's a lovely new word you've put in here, because the other thing I have to tell you about the book is that the writing is wonderful. The word peculation, he was found guilty of peculation, which is embezzlement. So that's a pretty nasty character.
Yeah, I mean, he was an absolute clown. I mean, I think the king said something along the lines of, I was surprised at his appointment, but not at his recall.
Yes.
So, I mean, he spent his entire life being incompetent. He went to Eton, then he studied in Germany, of all places. And then he just had a string of sinecures, which are basically paid positions that require no work in England. But despite all of, having his bum seriously in the butter, he was always out of cash. He was constantly living in debtor's sanctuary and stuff, like on the verge of bankruptcy. So the only reason he came out to South Africa was because he got a chance to get a nice fat salary. And he only lasted 18 months at the Cape, which, when you consider that it took like 6 months to get a letter here to tell him that he was fired, is quite an achievement.
Well, if you look at the period when he was here, 1795, and you look at the arrival of Van Riebeeck and Van der Stalen in the 1600s, at that point they are, government and law is kind of it's the VO's post in South Africa. So
Young arrived about 5 years after the British had taken over from the VOC. So it wasn't a company when he was here, but the legacy was here.
That's right.
So the guy, his predecessor, was actually quite competent. So the first British governor actually did a fairly good job, ran a pretty tight ship, set up some like structures and stuff. But like there wasn't enough oversight to cater for someone like him, Like if you had good intentions, you could do a good job, but he didn't.
And there was also enough fiddling between filling in papers you needed to send back to England when you were out in the colonies, So Matthew, who's your favorite?
So my favorite is also Sir George Young, but I unfortunately didn't have. Actually, I mean, I did Somerset, which was I thought Somerset was quite a good chapter to begin with, and then unfortunately Nick found Young, and it was just kind of almost. I mean, there's sort of comedy gold in Young, in the way that Somerset's a more sort of malevolent character, I guess. He was far more. But what was quite interesting about Somerset was that you had the arrival of the 1820 settlers, and they came with a group of people who then didn't want to live in the Eastern Cape and didn't want to, farm. They moved to Cape Town to live in a more kind of cosmopolitan I mean, it wasn't a city, it was just a town, but with them they brought certainly their sort of notions of, they were mainly Scottish actually, so they brought with them the sort of Scottish Enlightenment and certain romantic ideals about fairness and justice, and actually fairness for all people of all colours, and they brought two guys who came along, were a guy called Pringle and Fairbairn, who set up the first free press in South Africa, which was, I mean, for me, that was really, really interesting. And they really ran straight into Somerset. Somerset was a terrible, he tried to close them down. There was also, actually, for me, my favorite character in the book, although he doesn't really make too much of an entry, is a guy called William Edwards, who was the lawyer who took Somerset to court on a whole lot of issues of corruption. And William Edwards was this complete showman. He totally made absolute fools out of everybody in the courts. But it turned out that actually he wasn't even a lawyer. He had lied his way through everything. He was actually an escaped convict from Australia. And his name was actually Alexander Kay. And anyway, he was then thrown in jail, and Somerset tortured, did a little bit of sort of roughing him up, but then he came out of jail and went straight back at Somerset and got him into court, and just he was a really interesting guy. But also in the end, it turned out that they shipped him back to Australia. Well, literally Somerset sent him back to Australia, not knowing that he was actually a criminal. And when he got back to Australia, they were like, "Oh, we know you. You're the guy who escaped like 4 years ago." So he, I think that was a really interesting story. But I mean, this guy, in many ways, held Somerset to account, and as a result, all the court cases were published in Fairbairn and Pringle's newspaper that they had started, and that caused a huge amount of trouble. But it was interesting just as far as how the free press played an important role in ending corruption.
Well, what's important as well is that you do the depth of the research that both of you have done around the time period and the other characters or the who come into play. And as we said earlier on, when one learns history in South Africa, these names pop up, but all you really get is the dates that they were the governor here or the whatever there. And when you start to actually look at them as individuals, how venal some of them are, how cruel some of them are, how absolutely bigoted, and you realize that this tension between abuse of power and people at the receiving end of it has been here all the time. And then let's go back to quickly a little bit to the first whistleblower, who was Adam Tuss, in a way. I think that's quite interesting. If I don't know,
character himself, and he'd set up a farm in Groot-Constantia, which was quite a lovely place. So then Willem Adriaan got here in 1699, I think, as the governor, and one of the first things he did was to give himself the farm Vergelegen, which back then there was a company outpost there, but it was pretty wild out there. So he gave himself this massive patch of the Hottentots Holland, and then he used the company slaves, company materials, company seed, company everything to build this huge farm. And it had vineyards and thousands of cattle and grain and everything you can imagine. And then he sold this produce back to the company that he controlled at prices he controlled. So it was like the absolute perfect circle. I mean, you think Nkandla is bad. This is like,
well, that's exactly
times worse.
What you say in the book, and so the scheme and how it gets thought out and plotted.
Yeah, so it's perfect. It's a perfect loop. So anyway, Adam Tuss and Henning Huysing and 63 burgers in the Stellenbosch area. Burgers were like free citizens who weren't company employees who were farming. So they kind of just got so fed up with this because they were trying to make a living and they couldn't sell any produce because he had the lion's share and he controlled the prices and everything. So they, at great personal risk, they wrote a document sort of saying how terrible he was in secret. It's a lovely document full of color and stuff.
Did you manage to find that document? I mean, it exists.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole book. So, I mean, not the original. I've seen bits of the original, but there's a whole book. It's called Die Dagboek van Adam Tuss.
Oh, okay.
And anyway, so they wrote this huge document, which they smuggled onto a ship to Amsterdam. But then Willem Adriaan got wind of it. And, I mean, this is chapter 1 of the book, so it's all in the book. But basically, they were then thrown into the Donkergat in the castle and tortured. And
you make that space come alive, because so many of us have gone there, bored out of our skulls, taken there by some history teacher who's taken us to the hut and closed the door, and you don't really care. But you make these people, these rebels, these whistleblowers come alive so much that one sense of place in South Africa changes in a way. So that's also part of.
I think Adam Tuss spent about 14 months or so, I can't remember, over a year in the Donkergat in solitary, or not only in the Donkergat, but in solitary confinement, being questioned and etc. And he actually recanted his accusations. About 10 of them did, obviously under massive duress. But when it all came down to it, the guys in Amsterdam, or actually all over the Netherlands, the sort of board of directors of the VOC, took all the evidence at face value, and Willem Adriaan actually lost his job. So he got fired and he was forced to sell Vergelegen. But for some reason, and this is also familiar to Nkandla, he was allowed to sell the house at his own benefit. And he was meant to knock the house down at Vergelegen and just sell the materials. But recent excavation of Vergelegen kind of is pretty damn positive that the house was not knocked down, because it's still, the original foundations are there and stuff. So the guy who bought it clearly paid for the materials and got them to agree not to knock it down or something like that.
So the interesting thing is that, if we can perhaps take a step back and look and realize that colonialism and that imperialism itself arrived with a corruption inherent in its exploitation of various markets in the world at the start of globalization. Perhaps if we frame the ongoing corruption from that way. But I'd like us to move on to sort of someone who we see as the great corrupter, and that, of course, is Rhodes. Mm-hmm. Rhodes singularly stands out here, as far as I've gone, as one of the most bloody-minded, ambitious, ruthless. I'm not sure what his drives were, but if you both would like to pick up on what Rhodes means to corruption and what we are today.
So Rhodes, I think in many ways, Rhodes was kind of like Zuma, in that he was an absolutely hollow man. Like he stood for nothing. He didn't care. There was no particular. People see him as this arch imperialist. That's absolutely nonsense. Like, he used imperialism right in the last 5 years of his life here for his own advantage. He was in political bed with the Bond, which was essentially an Afrikaans farmers association that became a kind of political party. It was never quite right at the end it was a political party, but so he would go with anybody, do anything with, as long as it was the advancement of his interests. And he used money in a kind of quite extraordinary way, because it was never really about, there was nothing particularly ostentatious about, Groote Schuur or anything like that. I mean, it's a beautiful building, whatever, but he was just solely driven by his own interests, and he would do anything, absolutely anything, to get this. I mean, the first story that we talk about Rhodes is him basically trying to get the water pump in Kimberley, so the pumping of the water out of the Kimberley hole, which we've probably all seen, that came with a contract, and there was an engineer who did a very good job of pumping this water out, but he eventually paid this engineer to go and sabotage his own sort of water pump so that Rhodes could gain the contract. And there's quite a funny story about this Mauritian guy called Hoto, who, clearly he took the bribe. And I don't know if I want to ruin the story. It's just quite a funny story. He ends up in a commission, and the commission says, "Who paid you to sabotage this equipment?" Yes. And he has this moment of what should I do?
Don't spoil it.
Don't spoil it, because it's absolutely lovely. And you can almost sort of try and translate that moment in the commission to the Zonda Commission, where somebody says, well, maybe if I don't say it, but I those sort of little small nuggets as well. Where did you find those? Because generally, when one looks for these things, this kind of color that reveals character, in a way, because there's another court case as well that Rhodes goes to, and he just lies to his face, he's basically,
So. Yeah, I mean, so the story about the engineer and the Mauritian guy, that is told in a few places. The one to do with Henry Burton, which is the court case in the 1898 election, and actually came about through Sol Plaatje's biographer. So, Plaatje was friends with this guy called Henry Burton, who that really isn't written up in the books at all, other than in Brian Willen's Plaatje biography, and it's only mentioned once. And actually, then I read this, and my partner at the time I sort of started thinking, I keep hearing this guy's name, Henry Burton. It's like, I'm sure your grandmother mentions this guy's name. And she was like, oh no, he's my great-great-grandfather. So then I was like, okay, that's weird. And anyway, so then I started looking into the Cape records, and found out, he ran against Rhodes in the 1898 election, and Rhodes, was involved in bribery and all kinds of shenanigans. Yeah. And then Burton actually took him to court on a petition to do with corruption. And yeah, I mean, the court case is interesting because, I mean, when you read Rhodes's responses, it's just like, I mean, it's like Zuma type, there's just denial. Oh, I can't remember this all of a sudden. Where are the records for the payments? Oh, I don't know. I mean, did we have them? I think that they were somebody else. And actually then he went and, well, either him or his election partner. That's true. At least he did actually go to the commission. I mean, but
Rhodes probably felt comfortable enough that he would be let off the hook, because at that point he sort of controlled some of the levers of power, if not all of them.
Absolutely. And I mean, the judge who was a very famous guy called Henry de Villiers, who ended up the Chief Justice of South Africa, he. Years before, Rhodes had, and this was I was quite proud of finding this, he had given de Villiers 750 free shares of the British South Africa Company, and a lot of them had received these free shares. And there's actually one of the whistleblowers in the whole Rhodes story is a guy called James Rose Innes, who then I found this letter of James Rose Innes saying to Rhodes, "Thank you very much for the 750 shares that seem to have arrived in my account. I really don't think that it would be good for me to keep them. If you don't mind, I'm going to send them back to you because it will restrict me politically, in future." But so he sent them back, but de Villiers never sent them back. And then de Villiers is the judge.
What I would have done to find an email like that in the Gupta leaks, just one person saying, "Thank you, but I'm fine. I don't need anything."
I mean, you think he was the only one, eh?
Yeah, I mean, he is James Rhodes Innes is, again, it's just another. I mean, he sort of walks a tightrope, but he's a guy who is just has an absolute morality of steel. Like, he will not be bought, he will not be pushed around. He fights his own ground, which is a limited space because Rhodes is so powerful.
And a space which is hostile. And you sort of, the back of the mind, you wonder to yourself, what is it that shapes a character like that? Where it appears that your overwhelming ethos is corrupt, and you're just going to have, and I suppose anger at it, responds to a kickback, because it deprives people. But Rhodes's ambitions, kind of, in a sense, happened, with England's eye on him. I mean, how complicit was the colonial or the British government in allowing Rhodes's personal business interests, in a sense, and the South African government itself, and then Boers, and of course Black South Africans at this point, Rhodes has managed to enslave, populations of people all over.
Yeah, I mean, look, he was very influential with his money, and he pushed around a lot of people with that, and a lot of people. I mean, even somebody like Joseph Chamberlain wasn't initially taken with Rhodes, and even the Queen at one point sort of said to the people, there was a deputation from Bechuanaland that said, she said, stand up against him, don't. But then she gave up and gave him this concession, and I don't know, he was just and he bribed people in Britain. He definitely. There is a case where he handed the Irish Party, which was a very anti-imperialist party. They hated Rhodes, they hated the British government, but that he needed their vote to get through his British South Africa Company concession in what became Rhodesia, and he paid them £10,000 and that's well documented. He paid them, and they turned their vote. They were initially going to vote in the British Parliament against him. They turned around after the £10,000 had been given and voted for him. So, I mean, this stuff is just, but, everybody knew it at the time. It's what's so strange, it's just it's quite well documented.
It's the same, but Bell Pottinger paying, this British firm coming up with this manufacturing of a terminology which will take place, which will find roots in South Africa, and then paying people like Andile Mqigama to it's just insane. Money can do the weirdest things. Craig Morrison has asked a question in Pretoria. I just wanted to see. Oh, he asks us too. Interestingly enough, I thought about it this week because there was a protest in Joburg at William Nicol Drive, wanting to have it changed to William Madikizela Drive. And because I've read your book, I now know who William Nicol is, and I now totally agree with the protest. So maybe people should have a look at the book. Tell us about the cat named son of a Germany, William Nicol. Who wants to pick up on William Nicol?
So I guess William Nicol is mine, right, Nick? So Nicol was one of the founders of the Broederbond, and he's I guess one of the kind of also ideological sort of forefathers or makers of apartheid. I mean, he had around him all the Verwoerd and Diedrichs and all of these guys were actually juniors under him in the Broederbond. He brought them up. He actually, and the Broederbond sent them all off to Germany and Holland, and many of them hung out with Nazis, and so he then wrote a book with a guy called Geoffrey Cronje called Just Racial Apartheid, and I mean not just racial apartheid as in only racial, the justice of racial apartheid. So he's a pretty
I think
guy.
I should also point out that despite his name, he was Afrikaans.
Yeah.
And he was a Germany as well.
He sort of said like a Nazi. I mean, they weren't quite Nazis in the sense that there was Christian nationalism. There was a Christian element to that whole, but I mean, it was a sort of hybrid version of Nazism.
Yeah.
And
so what I love about what we're able to talk about here now, and that's why I've said earlier on that if it were up to me, I'd have this book in every single school in the country, because one teaches history in such a way that it becomes vivid. And now I think that we understand the William Nicol Drive thing. It's it's gotta go. But I want us to just quickly move on to Paul. Because, of course, there's this lovely myth that we all have created around, first of all, British government was perfect and lovely and colonial government worked well and it was rule of law and, the VOC was this and that and the other. And then we have Paul and the Trek and the Transvaal Republic and the finding of gold. Now, who wants to pick up Paul and
yeah, he's my...
That's definitely
my guy.
Go for it. Go for it. Fucking fluffy.
So Paul, he's a bit different to a lot of the characters in that I don't feel that he himself was that in it for the money or the personal gain or anything. Like, he definitely benefited from a system, but so with him, it was like he really believed in his country. And so he came up with the Boer Republic was established in 1854 or something, and then it was annexed by the British for 4 years. And then they had a big victory at Majuba, and the British got it back in 1881. And
the Boers.
They had the Boers got it back in 1881. Yeah. Sorry. And so they had their country, but they had not much else. They had some mealie farms and like no money. They were bankrupt. And so they needed to come up with a way to develop the country. And this Hungarian Jewish adventurer called Hugo Nelmapius sent a letter to Kruger saying, I've got a plan, President. You need to, if you give me the permission to manufacture booze and sugar, but give me the sole right to do this, I'll pay you £1,000 a year in return. So, Kruger said, yeah, this is a great idea. And it suited him because the farmers could sell their surplus grain to the liquor distillery. They could make some money. The government could make some money. It was the sort of developing industry in the country. And I don't know that this was such a bad policy in a complete agrarian backwater. But then 5 years later, gold's discovered. And suddenly the ZAR goes from this backwater to this like massive sort of financial hub. And I think what Kruger, his big error here was he stuck with his concessions policy. So instead of saying, okay, we've now got a serious, proper economy, let's come up with serious, proper structures. So he granted a guy called Edward Lippert a concession to manufacture dynamite. And I mean, you can imagine how much dynamite was required to keep all those gold mines going. So dynamite had only just been invented. So nobody really was, apart from Nobel, was very good at making it. So his concession...
Just tell people that, who was the creator of dynamite, just so that we...
Sorry, yeah. So Alfred Nobel, the creator of dynamite, and the guy who's now sort of in a fit of conscience gave his name to the Nobel Prizes, because he suddenly thought, oh, look, what have I done with dynamite? I better give something back. And he put a label on it saying, it's made in South Africa. So, I mean, and made a hell of a lot of money in the process. And a similar thing happened with railways. So Kruger would give a railway concession to someone who didn't know how to build a railway. The next day they'd sell it to someone who did for like double the price. And so
it's a bit like our tenders, and you've got these intermediaries, and I mean it's exactly that, subcontractors.
Yeah, so it was tenderpreneurs. What we call tenderpreneurs were then known as the third Volksraad. So there was a first Volksraad, a second Volksraad, and then the third Volksraad, which was more influential. But the other great thing about Kruger is there's this character, Eugene Marais, which it's quite interesting that he's also an Afrikaner hero. So anyone who did Matric Afrikaans, like we're not Afrikaans speakers, but we've all read Winternacht, which is a really beautiful poem written by Eugene Marais. But when he was 18, he was the editor of an opposition paper called Land en Volk. And he laid into Kruger on a daily basis. And it's just hilarious. I mean, like you think Die Son is colorful. This is like with knobs on. And so like, for example, then they passed a law that you said you couldn't publish, criticism of the government, but it didn't, it precluded, it didn't mention letters to the editor. So suddenly there's this every day there's letters from this guy called Africanus Jr. And it's clearly Marais himself, just in this paper, just laying. So yeah, it's just a lot of fun.
So would you say? I mean, the free press. I don't think it was free at all. If you go through the role of the media and the press and who controls what in the book as well, which is important in terms of where we go later. But in this instance, did it have any effect? Did Marais' writings result in any damage to Kruger at all?
So I mean what people forget is so Kruger's this national hero, but of many Afrikaans people, but there was massive Boer opposition to Kruger. And many people think that he lost the 1893 election to another Afrikaans general, Slim Piet Joubert, who was evidently the richest farmer in the ZAR, or one of, he had 29 farms, I think. But he was this really reticent political leader. He kind of said, if I'll do it if you insist. I don't want to challenge Kruger, but if you insist. So Marais and this other guy, Ewald Esselen, a young lawyer, kind of ran his campaign. And he lost by 800 votes, but officially. But they seem to think that he probably won. So they put in complaints saying that people who were dead voted, lunatics voted, kids voted. And I think the biggest evidence was that Esselen actually lost his own seat in Potchefstroom, I think it was, by 7 votes. And Esselen was hugely popular in his own seat. And it seemed like just impossible that he could have lost there. So the interesting thing about this is if the 1893 election had been won by Joubert, then the Jameson raid might not have happened, and then the Boer War might not have happened. And I mean, obviously, you can't play.
No, you can't.
Saying
because
what is the historian is a dangerous game, but it does seem worth pondering.
Because I mean, as Eugene Marais was quite progressive. I mean, and they were quite sort of in favor of that whole Uitlander argument that was going on at the time to be resolved in a better way than, Kruger dug in his heels and didn't want anything to do with the Uitlanders, and Eugene Marais and Slim Piet Joubert were a little bit more, they probably the Uitlanders issue wouldn't have been so egregious. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's a kind of...
But in the end, what happens is they find gold and capitalism crashes into the...
was going to end up in a war, and they were trying to rather resolve it at the polls and think, a more progressive government will be good for everyone.
Yeah.
But what is, I mean, also interesting is that the people supposedly who the British were trying to uphold their rights, the Uitlanders, they weren't that keen on fighting. You know, they were given the opportunity during the Jameson raid, and Rhodes and Jameson tried to push them to rise up, and Rhodes sent his brother in there. Frank Rhodes was there to kind of stir up trouble. And they sort of pondered it for quite a while and just thought, in the end of the day, they were like, you know, actually, we're actually okay here. You know, like our minds are working. Yeah, we don't have political rights here. But, you know, I think they all probably felt that it was actually okay. But this was the British imperialist sort of, you know, pushing and pushing and pushing. We want to take control of those minds. But largely speaking, the Uitlanders, you know, they weren't that upset by, I mean, certainly they weren't prepared to go to war over it. I mean, they were given the opportunity. They were sent guns and ammunitions and cannons and
once again, it just shows you how, you know, ordinary people get swept up in the politics that are happening behind the scenes, and you know when the resource is found. So let's move on then from, you know, the annexation of the Boer republics and what that results in, the wars and the schism between Afrikaans and English-speaking South Africans, and of course a complete ignoring of the vast majority of Black South Africa as active participants in political life. Interestingly enough, you know, when you think about the later emergence of the Broederbond, which you then talk about, and also about Brandwag, you see it more in relation to this cultural grouping that doesn't really think about Black people. Its main opposition is to British imperialism. At that point, you know, Afrikaans-speaking people don't, you know, and as the British do, just see, you know, Black South Africans as subjects of something. That this war with the Boers is different. So, what happens afterwards in 1935? We have the rise of the Broederbond. We have a cultural grouping, a language grouping of people who feel it's time for them to sort of reclaim. So let's talk a little bit. Who wants to talk about the role of Broederbond in corruption and how it becomes a sort of almost a deployment committee?
Yeah.
Sort of the equivalent of it, but a secret deployment committee.
So, yeah, I mean, you know, the Broederbond, I mean, the people like Nico Diedrichs, I mean, I essentially make Nico Diedrichs the kind of center of the story. He was, I mean, not only, you know, did he studied in Nazi Germany, he was very persuaded by the sort of Nazi system, but he was also fundamentally interested in money. And he, you know, he was always, you know, the basis of his theories was always that it would be economic you know, like power in South Africa would not be a revolution of guns. It would be a revolution of the economy and essentially the taking of the economy away from the British or English speakers.
Very early EFF.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, you know, what they did was incredible. They, you know, in secret, they organized all these, you know, things like Sanlam and Volkskas, and you know, all of these institutions were built to, you know, essentially gain economic power. Is working is that it's gaining money, but it does all these kind of subscriptions. It goes around to poor people, generally speaking, and takes money off the poor to put into this sort of, you know, piggy bank, and then they, you know, that's how they're working. And Ernst Malherbe, unfortunately, actually, I think your previous Irvert Kleinhans was talking about that report that was done on Orsevar Brandwag and the Broederbond, and that has kind of been. I haven't got his book yet, and I really want to read it, because that had a lot of details as to how, you know, how they were going about this and finance. But I mean, it was essentially economic capture was what the Broederbond was interested in. And they went about it, you know, and people sort of say, oh, well, you know, they uplifted the Afrikaans people. And, you know, that there's a certain element of truth to that, but they also did it completely illegally. Like it was.
And not only that, they did it at the expense and the ruination of the vast majority of people who were sort of forced into becoming migrant laborers. You know, ordinary family life was shattered. So, you know, that aspect of the bond and sort of how it informed policy. But, you know, what's interesting at the moment, and I don't want us to jump around it, but the loops in your book is what grounds it in the here and now is, we have a meeting between Solidariteit and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, where Solidariteit is doing the same thing that, in a sense, the Broederbond did, which is to collect money from Afrikaners to empower Afrikaners. And that's busy happening where you lose the ideology of apartheid as your grounding force. The economy becomes your focal point of empowerment. So these cycles keep coming through all the time, So let us, I don't know if any of you want to speak a bit more about...
a couple of questions here about Jan Smuts and Barry Herzog.
Oh, yes, okay.
So interestingly, that era is not included in this book. We just couldn't find anything juicy enough to fill a whole chapter. But we are working on another book on the elections that shaped South Africa, and Jan Smuts and Barry Herzog feature heavily. And someone asked whether Jan Smuts is a hero or a chop. I reckon he's probably more of a vorst. I don't know. You'll have to wait. He's a.
Actually, recently, in our research for the elections book, I came across 2 instances of kind of partial kind of corruption as far as Smuts and Louis Botha were concerned, but it's not. Yeah, I mean Merriman, who was one of. Yeah, I mean it's sort of. It's on a theme. They buy out a newspaper and they, do the whole sort of fake news kind of thing. They bought out a famous kind of English-speaking newspaper called the South African News, which was a kind of famous English-speaking paper set up against Rhodes, actually, initially. But it was quite popular in the Cape Colony, and they bought it out and they shooed the editor away. When the editor said, I'd like to, I have my own editorial line, and they were like, no, unfortunately not.
So let's quickly move on then, because you can spend a lot of time on the Broederbond here, and you've got lovely little Dietrich's nightmare. Dietrich's. One gets to see this man a bit more fully. Instead of this little awful man with a Hamburg hat on, you get to see the extent of his vision, in a sense. I want us to move on. We've spoken about the press earlier on about financing fake news.
So we could end in the murder, which is definitely Nick's.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, I mean Eshel Rudy. I mean he's also like a very, very interesting character. He's so Machiavellian. He wasn't actually a member of. What is quite rare about him is that he wasn't a member of the Broederbond, and he wasn't in the sort of inner circle of the apartheid kind of system. But he was an intellectual who wrote this book called The Paper Curtain. And they, Connie Mulder and Foster kind of realized, and this guy's, as a propaganda, kind of head of propaganda, this guy could do quite well. And he was just this very smooth talking, charming kind of, slithered his way through, the halls of power, and built
a bit like Jimmy Manye, maybe, sort of equivalent.
Yes, and charm all the way, and everybody seems to have liked him. Everybody. I actually a friend of mine said that his father-in-law lived next door to him in the 70s, and said, what a charming man, he's so charming. And he was quite sort of cosmopolitan as well, quite sort of, he was very aware of the world. He wasn't a sort of, he had sort of extraordinarily, terrible policies, but he was a guy who just, he knew his way around a kind of boardroom, and, but he set up essentially the Ministry of Information. The Ministry of Information was already there, but he was made the head of it. And he came up with this plan, which ended up being called the Information Scandal, which he would buy out newspapers and TV stations and around the world. So they had actually, this doesn't actually come into the book, but they had a magazine in Europe, and and what does come into the book, they had control of a filmmaking, television filmmaking news corporation, and then they set up this newspaper called The Citizen, which everybody thought was an independent newspaper. but it had this extraordinary sort of government line. And everybody kind of knew, and it was the Citizen. Die Burger seemed quite, people like, seems to be a direct translation of a National Party newspaper. Anyway, eventually it turned out that they had been funding through. They'd basically been funding this newspaper, and this guy, Louis Late, who they'd got as the kind of stooge to the big businessman to set up the paper, and Late didn't give a stuff about, he was along for the ride. He essentially took the money and put it in his own business. And
well, I think what people sort of need to remember about that time of Late and the kind of hijacking of the media is that, we weren't as connected as we were today. And I think that, to a certain extent within South Africa, there were magazines like Optima, Panorama before that, that government use of media to prop up its propaganda was very widespread. I mean, a lot of us from that age remember those publications because, we were cut off from being able to see any alternative news. So I don't know, do you think the info scandal's impact, particularly overseas, but backfired in the long run, or did it have some sort of...
I mean, I think they are. The ideas that they put forward are ones that I think still people hold. They put the idea like, with this kind of last bastion against the domino theory of communism, and we're fighting the good fight in Angola, and if Angola falls, I mean, well, if we don't win the war in Angola, the whole thing will come collapsing down on our head. I mean, that was their line, and that we were these noble, decent, civilized, rationalists who were out there to support democracy and freedom. I mean, God knows how that kind of worked, but anyway.
But this happens in the context of the Cold War as well. So,
exactly.
Those tensions get exploited enormously. I think we've got 10 minutes left. I wanted to just move to the Smith murders, which you said was your speciality, but I'm happy to talk through the Smith murders because it's something which I hadn't really, we haven't really been able to place it, slot it in like a piece of puzzle into a corruption puzzle at this point. The Smith murders is always just a bit kind of frayed at the edges. What went on there? So tell us a bit about the Smith murders and why it's significant in this context.
Well, I mean, look, we wanted to have a murder in the book, and this seemed like the obvious one. And we definitely, there have been whole books written on the Smith murders, and we don't attempt to solve the murder. But I mean, nobody's managed yet. But what does seem, a couple of days before the election, he had a meeting with this chap apparently called McDougall, penciled into his diary, and he got home and his wife had been shot and stabbed, and then they shot and stabbed him. And they were basically both killed in this house. And then the words Rao Thamm were painted on the wall in blood. And basically it was this huge mystery, and it was made to look as if some like psycho fringe group had done it. But, although nobody solved it, what does seem apparent is that it had been ordered by the very top of the apartheid government. And the whole Rao Thamm thing had been like a later bunch of people who'd gone in to make it look like a sort of crazed act. And so Smith had served he had been at the IMF in Washington. So he was a big economic sort of advisor dude. And then he came back and he worked for something called Santam International.
What year was this? Just tell us what year. Was this 78? 78.
No, when he was with, like 70.
Oh no, his murder was 77.
Yeah. So he was about 74.
Yeah,
Okay.
And then he was in this sanctions busting company. It was like a mysterious thing that had like this office with only 2 directors, and the office was like a one-room thing. And basically, it all sort of led back to Hendrik van den Berg, Lang Hendrik. And it just seemed like it had to be to do with money. Some people said it was definitely the info scandal. Some people said it definitely wasn't the info scandal. But Smith had let it slip to a lot of people in the days leading up to the murder that I've got something big that goes all the way to the top, and my conscience doesn't allow me not to say it. And then he was killed. So it's just kind of we put it in there because we wanted to show that, these people were prepared to kill to keep the corrupt boat sailing.
And it had all of the signs of the kind of information scandal around it. There was definitely, even the sort of Row Thamm, the information scandal had like lots of these weird organizations called the Committee of 10 and that something of this and the blah, blah of that. And Row Thamm also fits in very kind of, there were all these strange names that the Rudy and these guys came up with, and these peculiar organizations of one person with a telephone in Vienna or whatever, so it does seem to, I mean, it looks very kind of, the optics are very kind of like information scandal.
Circumstantial, which of course, in the real world, it means nothing in the end. We've got about 5 minutes left to go, and of course, you carry on in the book with the homeland leaders, Lucas Mangope, the Matanzima brothers. You have a look at corruption and how that spills over in there. And Wouter Basson features very much, I think, very importantly, also as one of the villains. And then we end with Jacob Zuma at this point. I mean, all of us are hoping we do end with Jacob Zuma in terms of corruption, but we know that's not true.
No.
If each of you,
I think the homeland leaders do just deserve a quick mention, just because
yes, they're wonderful.
They were fascinating to research, and I mean, the Mangope chapter is full of
one of the best,
crazy comedy and stuff. And I think also Sol Kerzner is such a big character in both of those chapters, because he sees, gambling's banned in the sort of Puritan apartheid country, but they've opened up these new countries which can write their own laws. So he just starts pouring his attention onto these people, and I mean, the Matanzimas and Mangope end up pariahs, but Kerzner ends up being best buddies with Mandela, and Sun City's still going strong, and it's got Miss World, and the Gary player is also still kind of a well-respected South African, despite being an opponent paid for basically Sodom and Gomorrah in their what was Sodom and Gomorrah in their eyes. Just so that they could have a 2-hour drive to watch some chorus girls and check Dolly Parton in the flesh and whatever.
They used to call the blue movies. I mean, Trump would have loved the whole idea. It would just so up his chaotic economic alley. Is there any look? I mean, I think the response. For me, this is such an important book because it gives you a sense, a real sense of what corruption is and why it is in our lives. And it's funny, and you've got great characters. And as I said earlier, I wish this would be. In everyone's books. Will we ever get rid of corruption? Is it possible? What do we do?
No, I mean, I don't think. No, it's part of human political life, I think. But I mean, what we can do is, make sure that hopefully make sure that our institutions are strong enough to kind of stand up against them, because throughout the book there are people who've stood up against all of this. And there isn't without hope, but we need stronger the hollowing out of what Jacob Zuma did to things like the NPA. I mean, that is a very bad situation, and that is what makes, in many ways, Zuma more agreed. It's that the apartheid government did manage to hollow out and stuff, pack the judiciary and all of that, but somebody like Rhodes never actually got total political control over. He never managed to affect the judiciary and not the judiciary, but people like the NPA in the manner that Zuma has, and so.
Before we do the last word, I think this adds to a body of work which presents an understanding for us of what corruption actually is. Unless you understand it, there's just no way you're going to be able to try and mitigate it in any way. Last words, Nick.
So I think when you get to the final chapter, which is about Zuma, so we kind of put him on trial and say you're accused of being the only one to refurbish, to build a house at government expense, and then we show actually every other character in the book did it. So that kind of is a nice way to end. It gives it shows that the tricks are the same. The exact way you pull it off may have changed, but giving a contract to your friend, or giving a contract for something you don't really need and paying too much for it. Like that's how it's always been done, and that's how it's still done. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I would love not to have to write a sequel, but looking at what's going on, the chances are pretty slim, you know?
Well, I think, as we said earlier on, there are other countries in the world who deal with their corruption in different ways. Singapore, we spoke earlier about China, where I think, premiers of regions get told by the party, get investment, grow your region, take your 10%, but for God's sake, just deliver. So there's
10% would be wonderful in our context.
In our context. So maybe there's this 10% thing, but now people won't do something if you offer it for free. They'll stop you from doing it because there's no one who can get any money. So if you're hoping to fix a pothole, together with your fellow citizens, some political party will come and say, you don't do this, it's our job, we're not doing it, we want a cut. It's outrageous. But I think it gets to a tipping point where society no longer tolerates it. We see it in South Africa. People are reporting cops who are asking for bribes. People have had enough. They understand the devastating effect of corruption. So thank you very much to both of you for a very engaging, wonderful, very timeless, important book. May it do well. You can get it at the Daily Maverick bookshop. Click somewhere and press things and you'll get it. Or you can just go get it at a bookstore. I highly recommend it. And it's not Christmas yet, but it might as well be. It's COVID, it's lockdown. Read and have fun and still be located in South Africa and understand where we come from. It ain't pretty, but it is pretty too,